Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's lecture. This is the last of our presentations in the 2022 Winter CGS Thursday Lecture Series. And due to an updated guidance from the university regarding the COVID policy, this lecture will only be in a webinar format. My name is Reginald Jackson, and I'm an Associate Professor of Pre-Modern Japanese Literature and Performance in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures here at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. And it is my distinct pleasure to host today's talk by our inaugural Center for Japanese Studies Postdoctoral Fellow, Dr. Linda Galvan. But first, a few announcements. As mentioned, this will be our last CGS lecture for Winter 22, but please check out our CGS events page or various social media for CGS lectures scheduled for fall of 2022. Also, I'd like to alert you to the fact that Ann Arbor Japan Week returns this year from June 12th through June 18th. So please join us for a week of Japan-related programming designed for families and children. All events are free and open to the public. And so then please keep an eye on our homepage and social media pages for more information. As you'll have noticed, attendee webcams and microphones have been muted, but we do invite you to use the Q&A function during the lecture to submit any questions you might have, and the presenters will try to address as many of those as possible. So with that said, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Linda Galvan, our speaker for today. Dr. Galvan earned a doctorate in Japanese literature from Stanford University, where she completed a dissertation entitled "How Many Shades of Brown? Excremental Rhetoric in Modern Japanese Literature." Dr. Galvan also completed a PhD in Comparative Literature at Osaka University in 2015 with a dissertation entitled "The Hybridity of Sexuality, Japan and the Russian Literature of Orientalism, Postmodernism, and Post-Fordism." Dr. Galvan is a remarkable scholar for many reasons, not least of which is the depth of her knowledge, her multilingual capacities as a researcher, and theoretical rigor that she brings to her interpretations of texts. Her research is focused primarily on modern Japanese literature and, in her own terms, quote, engages with the marginal, the transgressive, and the liminal. She says that she is interested not only in identifying subject matter that can be characterized as invisible, transgressive, or liminal, but more importantly, in exposing the mechanisms that lie beneath various types of marginalization, transgression, and discrimination. Dr. Galvan's publications include Roshia ni okeru operetta geisha no seiko, or the success of operetta geisha in Russia, which is bilingual in in Japanese and English. She's written and published in studies in Japonism. She's also written representations of Japanese women in the Russian war prisoner writings. F. Kupaczynski's Oikusan, Okusan. She's also written in the middle, somewhat Japanese-Russian mixed blood characters in contemporary Russian literature for a special issue of the New Zealand Slavonic Journal. She's also published a Latvian translation of Oi Kanzaburo's Kojinteki na Taiken. Dr. Galvan has won research support from the Mellon Foundation, Japan Foundation, and a recent collaborative teaching project fellowship from Stanford University. She's also been very busy organizing and chairing conference panels such as the Excreting Female Bodies in and of Japanese Literature for the Association for Asian Studies Annual Conference, Generative Fictions, Representations of Pregnancy, and in Modern Japanese Literature and Manga, and then also Politics of Transgressive Sexualities in Modern Japanese Literature. She's also given a number of conference presentations, many of which I'll refrain from mentioning given the talk's proximity to lunchtime, but suffice it to say she's been incredibly active as a scholar, a writer, a teacher, and a presenter over the past decade. In addition to her published pieces, Dr. Galvan also brings a wealth of teaching experience to the table, having served as co-instructor or instructor for courses such as How to Be Modern in East Asia, Japanese Performance Traditions, Introduction to Modern Japanese Literature and Culture, and as a teaching assistant for Romance, Sexuality, and Gender in Japanese Literature, in addition to Japanese language courses. Additionally, at Osaka University, she helped teach courses such as Literature and Language of Japan and China, Introduction to Japanese Legal and Political System and Law, and beginning and intermediate Russian language. She's also served, importantly, as a coordinator of the East Asian Studies Workshop at Stanford University. Dr. Galvan brings such a wealth of experience to the table that we were very privileged to be able to bring her in as our first CGS Postdoctoral Fellow. And suffice it to say, both faculty and graduate students were really impressed by Linda's breadth of expertise, and we've been happy to welcome her here to the CGS community. Here, since she came here in the fall of last year, she's worked closely with our MERS and CGS students, teaching courses such as bioethics and biopolitics in Japan, the literature of waste in modern Japan, and gender and performance in Japanese culture over this past year. I can say that I and many of my colleagues have been really impressed with her performance thus far, especially as our inaugural CGS Postdoctoral Fellow. And that given her her talents as a literary critic of remarkable linguistic skill and conceptual breadth, Linda has also sought to actively assist our MA students and participate in various classroom activities, bringing exciting speakers and making herself known throughout the CGS and broader Michigan community here. I think it's also fair to say that she's exceeded our expectations and has really been a truly wonderful resource for our students since her arrival. I can say personally that it's been great to have her as a colleague and to get just glimpses of her considerable potential as a scholar in our regular talks from week to week. And I'd want to say that her contribution to the CGS community more broadly this past academic year has really been a godsend in many ways, not just in terms of the courses she offered, but also in terms of the support she's offered to other colleagues and to students. Her contribution to our community has been substantial, and we're all very grateful for her presence and efforts and look forward to seeing her work as it develops in the future. So with all of that said, please join me in welcoming Dr. Linda Galvan, who today will be presenting a talk entitled Literary Toilet Papers of Japan and Beyond.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Reggie, for this really generous introduction, and thank you all so much for attending my talk today. I feel very honored to be the last speaker of the CJS lecture series, spring 2022. I would also like to use this opportunity to thank Professor Shinobu Kitayama, Barbara Kinzer, Yuri Fukazawa, and Gillian Locke, who always work behind the scenes of this lecture series, and without whom these talks and conversations would not be possible. It's been a pleasure to work with you this year. Lastly, I want to express my immense gratitude to our Japanese studies librarian, Keiko Yokota Carter, who has kindly helped me access resources indispensable for my work, and in the process has contributed to the rather curious collection of materials on toilet and toilet paper related matters that the library here at the University of Michigan has developed this year. So let me just share my screen with you all. I hope you can see it now. Well, so I'll start. My talk today is in the broader framing about the confluence of literature and materiality, or more precisely, the materiality of toilet paper. To state that materiality matters, and that it matters in particular with regard to toilets, is nothing new. Scholars use the term, the material turn, in the humanities and social sciences during recent decades to refer to a paradigm shift in the way that human beings relate to objects and nature more broadly. While conventional wisdom maintained a dual structure of thought that divided humans and everything else, theories following the material turn have challenged these dualisms and brought forth a variety of frameworks aimed at decentering static anthropocentrism, instead insisting upon the co-constituting relationship between humans and the non-human world, including material objects. Things in this contemporary way of thinking are not passive objects that are simply acquired and discarded, but rather active agents in a world that is continuously coming into being with and around us. And so scholars in the ever-broadening fields under the rubric of new materialism are trying to understand and theorize these objects and our relationship to them. And this, of course, includes things which we consider to be waste. My interest is in waste material, though as I will explain in more detail momentarily, and as you heard in the introduction, my research has focused primarily on human waste, namely excrement, and its associated objects, particularly toilets. In the field of inquiry of new materialisms and eco-criticisms, waste is generally considered a vibrant, dynamic, and agentive matter. But while there is a reasonable amount of scholarship on the intersections of waste and literature, few studies manage to balance materiality and literary analysis. My own contribution has been to strike a balance and to theorize literary representations of excrement, toilets, and other forms of waste in the context of modern Japan. Moreover, absent from the broader conversation is a non-human material, which many of us likely discard on a daily basis. And so my aim today is to pay a little bit of attention to those little squares of toilet paper and to consider toilet paper as an extension of my research and thus as a complex and sometimes paradoxical medium of literary production. I have organized my talk around several distinct experiences that delineate my journey with a topic, each allowing me to unfold and explore a particular aspect of toilet paper as manifest in literature. My interest in toilet paper and its relationship to literature has developed from my doctoral research at Stanford University. In my dissertation, I examined representations of fecal matter in works of 20th century Japanese prose fiction, drawn from across the spectrum in terms of literary style and perceived status within the Japanese literary canon. My work required paying attention to what sociologist David Inglis, building on Pierre Bourdieu's work on habitus, denotes as toiletry habitus, namely all of the aspects of waste management, toilet construction, excretory practices, and the ways of speaking and writing about waste that are shared by people at a given time and place, in my case, modern Japan. But while my work paid particular attention to literary representations of toilet fixtures and waste management practices, I admit that I disregarded toilet paper as little more than a supplemental material, making up a given toiletry habitus, but not necessarily worthy of its own consideration. It was not until the outset of COVID-19 in the spring of 2020 that I had my first realization with regards to the potential for toilet paper as a distinct form of aesthetic materiality for future further research. As we all well remember, the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic caused, among other things, what has since been denoted as a 2020 toilet paper panic. Toilet paper became one of the most sought after commodities under the uncertain circumstances. On the news and through other social media channels, we saw videos of consumers stockpiling toilet paper and images of empty shelves in the stores. A subsequent surge of pieces of opinion journalism and academic studies provided not only information about toilet paper, its production, distribution, and sales mechanisms, but also analysis of some of the potential driving forces behind the panic. The stress caused by COVID-19, in addition to other factors, related specifically to gastrointestinal disorders, was being manifest in the form of a dire concern with toilet paper. This furthermore reflected a variety of deep-seated social, cultural, as well as cognitive biases that reveal the power dynamics of the toilet habitus. In other words, the toilet paper panic flung open the bathroom doors of our private spaces. Comparisons at the time in the spring of 2020 were made to a similar panic in 1973 during the first oil crisis. Johnny Carson joked about the shortage of toilet paper on his talk show, saying, there is an acute shortage of toilet paper in the good old United States. We gotta quit writing on it. A few months prior to the toilet paper panic in the US in 1973, however, a similar panic had already occurred in Japan. Eiko Maruko Shinaber talks about this in her 2018 study, Waste Consuming Post-War Japan, pointing out that there is less certainty about the origins of Japan's panic, though several possible factors have been identified. Regardless of the origin, what followed was a familiar run-on toilet paper, exacerbated by Japanese media, including NHA's call for the rational and frugal use of toilet paper, and Asahi newspapers' reports of toilet paper stockpiling and shortages around the country. The stocking up of toilet paper, as well as other products, in both cases seems to speak to a broader phenomenon characterized by social cognitive biases, namely, as Tina Sika has pointed out in her 2020 article, Feminist Materialism and COVID-19, the toilet paper roll became, quote, fixed as a material semiotic object representing a whole host of fears, relations, and norms, end of quote. But toilet paper under the same circumstances can also become an object of collective relief. A satirical illustration of this capacity of toilet paper to symbolically alleviate stress can be found in François Rabelais' 16th century French masterpiece, The Life of Gargantua and Pantagruel, when the giant Gargantua returns from war with the most lordly, the most excellent, and the most convenient means to clean his behind. A long list of materials are enumerated, from articles of clothing made from various fabrics to plants, vegetables, and animals, and thus finally the treasured object, the neck of a live goose. This inventory of anal cleansing materials shows how the objects of toiletry habitus, such as toilet paper, can take on, as part of its material semiotic status, a palliative function through humor. Still, the toilet paper panic in 2020 left me wondering, what is the story of toilet paper? Toilet paper is a relatively recent phenomenon in human history, and globally speaking, is only used by a quarter of the world's population. Some of the more commonly used objects for post-excretion cleansing have been based on factors such as local materials, occupation, and social standing, and include things such as flat stones, seashells, sand, snow, leaves, moss, corn cobs, hemp ropes, rags, sticks, water, and of course, paper. One schema for classifying cultures by these objects has been put forth by Ronald Bloomer, who proposed 3 categories: scrapers, wipers, and washers. These types are not strictly defined. In fact, some societies in history have used multiple materials in conjunction. For instance, early founders of Islam would scrape off fecal matter using stones before then washing themselves with water. Some of these objects are specific to a time period or society, and while some are currently obsolete, for instance, this Roman sponge stick, others are still used in various parts of the world, use rags, for instance. Paper falls into this latter category. As probably many of you here today know, paper was invented in China in approximately the 2nd century BC. And as one might expect, this included a grade of paper used for wiping one's rear, or literal, which means grass paper, literally. In the West, the manufacture of paper didn't begin until the 15th century, and it was only in the mid-19th century that the industrial production of paper began in England, which led to the further development of toilet paper in North America. Here you can see some of the important years. When it comes to Japan, in the 8th century, wooden sticks called shugi, or less commonly kusobera, literally shit sticks, were brought to Japan from India and China alongside Buddhism. Using Bloomer's typology, classical Heian era Japan would be considered a scraper society. Having learned paper making from China, Japan also developed its own distinct technology for paper making, using as material plants such as kozo and mitsumata and gampi that you can see here. The oldest record of paper being used for anal cleansing, together with shugi, can be found in the 12th century scroll, The Hungry Ghosts. Here you can see the person defecating is holding a wooden stick, while the ghosts are impatiently waiting for the fecal matter. While on this slide, I have zoomed in on the scattered papers. More widespread use of toilet paper, however, can be observed during the Edo period or from the 17th century onwards, following the development of recycling practices and the subsequent production of recycled paper. The most renowned brand of toilet paper in Japan was Succipus Paper, referred to by its trade name, along with otherwise generic terms, chirigami or otoshigami. The world toilet paper, toilet paper, was introduced to Japan in 1899 in an advertisement in Chuo Shimbun, although the manufacturer of this toilet paper is unclear. Nevertheless, it was around the turn of the century that department stores began selling imported toilet paper, while the first record of domestically produced toilet paper roll is from 1924 by Tosa Tissue Paper Manufacturing Association. As in the United States, toilet paper during this time was a luxury item in Japan. Most people instead use newspapers or other scrap material paper. It was only after World War II and the increased presence of flush toilets that toilet paper became a more ubiquitous commodity in Japan, with various local producers joining forces with foreign manufacturers such as Scott and Kleenex. But while this recurs into the history of toilet paper suggests a rather neat trajectory in Japan's toiletry habitus, in reality, the story is less straightforward. As linguist Masa Yoshio has argued in his detailed 1974 case study on pre-toilet paper habitus in Nagano Prefecture, a variety of materials were used in Nagano, including leaves, tree bark, straw, and hemp, even after the introduction of toilet paper in the first quarter of the 20th century. The modernization of anal cleansing practices in the narrow sense of Nagano, let alone Japan as a whole, was in other words, and perhaps continues to be a bit of a messy process. While currently Japan's toiletry habitus is associated around the world with its washlet or bidet-type toilets, for instance, Todo, domestically Japan is as dependent upon toilet paper as we are in the United States. This much was evident at the start of the pandemic in 2020 and confirmed by Yuzawa Noriko, professor in sustainability studies of Osaka University. The toilet paper shortage 2 summers ago was, in hindsight, a real-life instantiation of some of the concepts I explored in my doctoral research. But it was here at the University of Michigan that I began putting some of the pieces together. In the autumn semester of 2021, I had the unique opportunity to sit in on a class called Paper Making and Water Printing, taught by professor and artist Andy Poshkovich at the Stamp School of Art and Design. And I had the chance to not only observe how students make washi, Japanese paper by hand, but also to participate myself and learn some of the techniques. Here you can see the whole process unfolding step by step, from the smashing of the raw mulberry kozo with a wooden mallet, the gentle spreading of the pulp across a wood frame screen, to the gratifying feeling of the paper from its mold. And I also have it actually here with me, the final product. I also had the chance to see how the students worked with the paper to create amazing works of visual art. While the paper I created was not toilet paper, my experience of Professor Poshkovich's paper making class has been instrumental in helping me rethink toilet paper as part of a communal artistic setting. I started to think of paper as a medium of not just creativity, but also of community. And consequently, I have begun to think of toilet paper as a medium of creative community, not unlike literature itself. The remainder of my talk today will introduce a few works of modern Japanese literature, which in their thematic and formal relationship to toilet paper have helped me to sharpen up my conceptualization of toilet paper as a complex and worthwhile literary medium. Earlier on, I mentioned the famous brand of recycled paper produced in the Asakusa neighborhood of Tokyo, and thus known as Succipus Paper. In addition to its use as toilet paper, Asakusa paper was also used as a facial tissue and thus should be rather considered as a toilet paper in the original meaning of the French word toilette, meaning a dressing room, which implies grooming. The materiality of the paper was of interest to the writer and physicist Terada Torahiko in his 1921 essay, Asakusa Paper. In his essay, Terada zooms in on a yet unsoiled piece of Asakusa paper, picking it up and closely examining its color and tactile materiality, a dull red color, feel of its surface, smooth on one side but rough, resembling a loosely woven mat on the other, and the variety of fibers from which it is made. Terada continues his scrutiny of the paper with a close look at the smaller and colorful pieces of scrap paper out of which it is made, including its organic and inorganic material. And even tries to read the composite paper, distinguishing letters and words printed in the original paper. Quote, some characters were printed with black ink on an ordinary white background. I can read only one character at most, and at most two characters. I picked it up and read it. Some characters, for example, all and yen, were understandable, but strange characters such as shaking also appeared. It made me feel as if it was also some deep mystery. When I found a phrase, is it a dragonfly, that seemed to be from the haiku section of the newspaper, it made me feel funny, and I just laughed by myself. Terada contemplates the complexity of various connections and cultural systems that are recorded in the materiality of the paper. As I was looking at it, the history of these many pieces of things became more and more interesting to me. Various articles manufactured in various factories that have nothing to do with each other are gathered once in a paper waste basket of one house through various roads, and then mixed with waste from other houses to make a tank in the paper mill. What complex systems were entangled there? I couldn't trace them now that it had become a sheet of Asakusa paper. All I could do was to think of the endless complexity of the causal mesh that was vaguely laid out in the everyday world. From the initial somewhat mindless examination of the paper, Terada's realization of the paper's latent and entangled systems leads him to several intellectual and metaphysical contemplations on the nature of originality, art, plagiarism, and the origin of material and immaterial worlds is a conclusion that even Asakusa paper could not have been produced out of nothing. Throughout his life as a writer and physicist, Terada spent time observing patterns in a variety of objects and phenomena, from seashells and snowflakes to animal tracks, and he was interested in the role that the senses play in systems of knowledge. Alongside his research on X-ray diffraction, his essay on the Asakusa paper allowed him to engage his senses in an exploration of a complex material, while also unleashing his analytical and creative faculties. Gregory Golly draws attention to Terada's extraordinary capacity for sensing and thinking in his 2008 study, When Our Eyes No Longer See, Realism, Science, and Ecology in Japanese Literary Modernism, referring to how Terada used raw sensation to grasp patterns, laws, and relations, spurring his eccentric forays into what he called the physics of form. According to physicist Matsushita Mitsugu, Terada in fact shifted in his approach to the material world around 1915, whereas he initially followed the tendency of the times and sought to decompose a given object of study into its elementary parts and then analyze in detail that which was considered essential. He later abandoned this reductionist approach in favor of what are today called emergent phenomena, that is, features of complex systems that cannot be understood by means of deconstruction. Such systems, Mitsugi explains, are ones in which the constitutive and various pieces get tangled together in a complex way and yet are unified through nonlinear interactions. In such a system, due to complex interactions among the members and their non-linearity, a variety of distinguishing features may emerge in a self-organized way. of some minor event may develop into a major event occurring over the whole system. It is precisely this emergentist approach that Teilhard takes towards the Succipus Paper in his 1921 essay, and which not only offers a precedent for the examination of the patterns and properties latent in every material in general, but also grounds my own forays into the emergent features of toilet paper more specifically. The mediation on toilet paper in Teilhard's essay is a testament to the power of literature to offer close examinations of the materiality of everyday objects. But if Teilhard's work offers a glimpse into how the significance of toilet paper can be reframed in literature, then the horror novella trilogy Drop, written by Suzuki Kojic, better known for the Ring series, puts a postmodern or self-reflexive spin on the relationship between literature and toilet paper. Drop was published in 2009 by Hayashi Paper Company, a Shizuoka-based toilet and tissue paper manufacturer. One might find it odd that a toilet paper company is publishing literature, but Hayashi's Paper Company produces a variety of novelty items, and you can have your customized order too. As part of my course here at last semester, Literary and Cultural Sewage Systems of Japan, we read Suzuki's toilet paper novella, its translation in English, in class. This was an interactive reading experiment, which didn't turn out exactly the way that I had anticipated. Contrary to what one might expect, the toilet paper novel consists of a single short story, which repeats several times over the course of the role. And here I have it too. Entire story is approximately 3 long toilet paper squares in length, about 33 inches, roughly corresponding to 9 squares used in the bathroom. Standard size sheets. While the number of squares used in the bathroom obviously varies depending on the many factors, on average, people use about 8.6 standard squares of toilet paper per toilet use. Suzuki's novella is written, in other words, to be read in one sitting. The work begins by signaling its subject and genre. Nothing better suits as a stage for a ghost story more than an old well, but you rarely see a well these days. However, places with conditions similar to old wells can be seen everywhere: toilets. The story unfolds by more emphatically addressing the reader in the second person and establishing the setting in a public toilet where you, the reader, find yourself with an urgent need to use the bathroom. Unexpectedly, perhaps the second person narration is hemmed in during the third chapter of the novella, when the identity of the you is more concretely established rather than left to the imagination of the reader. Now you must decide your sex. For the sake of the story, you are a woman in her 20s. The story goes on to describe how the female addressee, the you, notices a smudge on the wall and then scratches it off, following written directions there to look upward, where she, coded as you, comes face to face with someone of an unspecified gender. The story ends with a description of several drops of an unspecified liquid falling onto the toilet paper that she is holding, mixing with her drops of sweat and turning the toilet paper blue. Narrative-wise, the second part of the trilogy continues building up tension, beginning with a detailed description of the face that appears in the first part, and ending with you finding a toilet paper roll, not unlike Suzuki's toilet paper novella, wrapped in a black package, with an image of a pale face of a woman floating on a black background. The final volume ends with the realization that 20 years have passed. You returns to the bathroom and finds herself peering over the partition of a bathroom stall down at a woman, and realizing that you are a ghost. You shed tears that fall on the toilet paper in bluish smudges. The students found the experience wanting. In addition, and me too. In addition, the storyline of the horror novella left us completely dissatisfied, leading to the conclusion that Suzuki's toilet paper novella is but a trivial novelty item with little literary value. But whether it fulfills expectations of the genre of horror or not, Suzuki's story produces a particular emotional effect on the reader. And this is only partly a factor of the content of the story and its postmodernist play with a narrative and readerly perspective. To be sure, the use of the second person addressee creates a fuzzy relationship between the fictional character and the reader, even when the character you appears to be an autonomous third-person entity with her own sensory experience. Such stories might be thought of as communicative objects of study rather than narratological ones, per Monica Fluder. The perhaps more interesting effect of Suzuki's novella was our collective realization that the toilet paper on which the novella is read already destabilizes a host of conceptual dichotomies we usually bring to the reading experience. This novella, we came to agree, is supposed to be read in a public toilet, as depicted in the story. Consequently, we start to realize that we are partaking in a collective experience, proceeding from square to square by unrolling a story which others before us have read, and others after will also read from the same roll of toilet paper. The privacy of the public bathroom stall is transformed by the experience of reading, and more precisely by the materiality of the work itself, rather than its content or linguistic form, into another kind of communal space. The medium conveys this radical potential to destabilize the dichotomies of public and private, individual and communal, and even functional and decorative, ephemeral and durable. Thrust into a collective experience, yet all alone in a bathroom, we might begin to consider the toilet paper we discard or flush away as a fleeting medium of a more complex network of objects and inhabitations. We might see the toilet paper as both transient and lasting, a functional object with aesthetic potential. We might see each square of the toilet paper, as Terada Torahiko did, as not simply a uniform colored paper, but if you look closely, you can see various regular patterns, stripes, and dotted lines on it. Terada suggested that there was more to Succipus paper than mere toilet paper, and a close look at Suzuki's toilet paper novella might transform it from a trivial novel item into a literary work whose unique value is in part a factor of its commoditized medium. A certain final work of toilet paper literature today might, I suggest, provide yet another dynamic intersection of the material and literary and simultaneously private and shared experience brought forth by this intersection. In 2006, the Japanese toilet manufacturer and currently the world's largest producer of toilets, Toto, announced a peculiar literary contest called the Toilet Senju Prize. Still ongoing today, with the 17th annual contest results having been announced in November 2021, various prizes are given for the world's best toilet-related senju, which is a genre of Japanese short poetry that resembles haiku in its form. 17 morai arranged in a 5-7-5 sequence. Thematically, however, senju are more humorous than haiku, with subject matter taken from everyday life and human imperfection. The Toilet Senju contest can be submitted by anyone in the general public with several categories of prizes, the top award being Toto products. It is not unusual for Japanese companies to organize senju competitions as a form of marketing and promotion. In fact, one of the special categories of the Senryu Prize is named after Nakahata Takashi, a well-known copywriter, not only known for his advertising catchphrases, including the famous Toto bidet commercial one, but also for selecting Senryu verses on a variety of topics for the Mainichi Shimbun Senryu column since 1991. What distinguishes Toto's Toilet Senryu Prize from others is that all selected finalists' work is published on a usable toilet paper roll sold at the price of 210 yen per roll. Just as in the case of Suzuki's toilet paper Novella drop, the Toto Senryu competition signals an experience of toilet paper that is both aesthetic and yet functional, private and yet communal. I'd like to share some of the Senryu selected from the most recent competition. They vary in terms of topic and tone, and while I'll slowly show you, you can read them to yourself. I wouldn't want to make any assumptions, but I think it is safe to say that something amusing or in the very least relatable can be found in each toilet paper poem. It is tempting to dismiss the Senryu competition as a simplistic and trivial marketing strategy of a massive global manufacturing corporation, with the Senryu being of little to no intellectual or aesthetic value. After all, the poems are meant to be flushed down the toilet to dissolve into the depths of an invisible underground sewage system. And yet, considering the Senryu as part of an experience of reading, say as a sequence produced by many different individuals and also shared with other readers, it may be possible to conceive of this curious collection as a contemporary form of Japanese ranga, or linked poetic verse, each fleeting and yet each leading to the next, creating an experience of duration. Still, the history of toilet paper is smudged with cases of blatant bias. Certain types of paper are reserved for culturally esteemed textual activities, and other types are relegated to the rear. In 6th century China, the artist, philosopher, and politician Yan Zhite noted that paper on which there are quotations or commentaries from the 5 classics or the names of sages are then not used for toilet purposes. Even the earliest mass toilet paper manufacturers in the late 19th century shied away from putting their company names on their products. That is until the Scott Paper Company proudly and shamelessly bucked this trend in 1879. The history of toilet paper is also rife with examples of literary and cultural figures using toilet paper to disparage works of literature, from the Roman poet Catullus to Martin Luther, from Thomas More to James Joyce in Ulysses, etc. Perhaps it is high time to rethink this lowly literary medium. Today, I've tried to unfold my own process of rethinking toilet paper over the past year, looking back and reconstructing the moments and experiences of realization, fragile though their perforated connections may seem. And I've tried to show that literature, and more precisely the materiality of literary works, can instigate a reassessment of toilet paper and its capacity to break us out of our often constricting conceptual dichotomies, but not simply for the sake of subversion, not just to upend the way that we see and engage with everyday objects of literary habitus and other forms of waste, but also, and perhaps rather, to capture something fleeting and precious that has given bright speckles to this investigation, a surprising sense of community that streams from this humble object. Toilet paper can connect us in unexpected and delicate ways. It's among the things we share. And I thank you for letting me share my work with you and for sharing your time with me and each other. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Linda, for that really stimulating talk. So I think as Jillian mentioned to folks in the chat, if you have any questions that you'd like to add, please use the Q&A function, which you should see at the bottom of your Zoom screen, to add those, and we can start to go through some of those. So please feel free to take a minute to do that. And while we do that, I have so many questions, actually. So I'm happy to engage in conversation this afternoon, Linda, about your work. I've read part of the dissertation and so forth, so it's really interesting to think a little bit about among other things, kind of how COVID, has changed / warped the world, but then also how it brings to the fore just a kind of a deeper awareness of certain types of vulnerability for one thing, not just of the material world, but of these kinds of human connections, I think. And so it's really interesting it's very kind of you to to narrate some of the aspects of your experience as a teacher and as a student here in Michigan to think about that. But I was really struck by the last thing you said about community and this sense of the delicacy of that and how toilet paper is mediating that. So I was wondering if you could say a bit more about, not having read the Drop series, could you say a little bit more about how in that text, that kind of delicacy, I understand it's a horror film, not film, a different kind of film maybe, but how that theme of, say, delicacy and community is playing out. We got a glimpse from some of the readings, but I just wonder if you could unpack that a bit more, besides just getting sucked into a toilet by a ghost. What's the nature of that, and to what extent is that being commented upon?
Thank you for your question. So there are, of course, several ways that we can think about this text, and I didn't pay attention to many aspects of it. I could have analyzed its materiality and engagement with senses, but it is exactly, I would say, attention to modalities, and particularly olfactory modality that comes up throughout the trilogy, that shows its delicacy and also ephemerality, and somehow gives a look on a different relationship with the body. So that's one thing, because, for instance, there are scenes where you senses, so upon entering, even in the bathroom, there is this scent of perfume, and it does give kind of us a sense what will happen later, because it's a perfume that you has used before, but it's kind of through the sense that there is this connection with who has been before, who uses that public toilet, for instance, right? And then another aspect where we can see some kind of delicacy is through the encounter with people in the park, because you goes outside and no one notices you, and well, the character you, and there is this fragility due to this not being noticed that we can observe, and a poster that you has gone missing. And so this really, I think, speak to delicacy of connections, because we realize someone might go missing, and no one perhaps cares, or someone also could be standing there, and in the story it's a ghost, but not being seen is a very, I think, common thing that happens, unfortunately. So there are these moments that if you pay attention to them, that they bring out delicacy of the text. And of course, it's also, I have to say that it's a rather flimsy paper. It's two-ply toilet paper, but I got the English translation, because the Japanese translation original, unfortunately, can be bought only in bulk. So I would be actually interested in comparing the materiality of the text too, because this is rather delicate.
Great, thank you so much for that. That's really fascinating. I mean, it strikes me that I mean, I really appreciated what you said in your reading about the fragility and kind of the thematic of this fear of anonymity being part of what's being amplified in the context of this horror text. And it seems to me, in a way that I hadn't thought about before, like this concern about subjectivity. I mean, or the relationship between, say, I mean, it sounds kind of hopefully not too Orientalist, or hackneyed, but the stereotypical sense of the tension between individuality and kind of societal relations in Japan in particular, as this is a really ripe kind of place for thinking about that kind of tension. And I was looking just at some of the award-winning Sinryu that are mentioned, and one mentions basically like the toilet is a space of escape, or, you know, of being able to kind of get some kind of refuge or respite from like the outside world. But one of the things that would mean, presumably, is leaving behind some of those social identities, because everyone is united, you know, at a certain level when you squat or sit on the toilet. And so that sounds really fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, if I may add,
Please,
to that, another kind of type of literary toilet papers that I do want to include in my work, and I've started considering, is also papers that are written in toilets. Or I mean, obviously, more broadly, we have to think then of Natsume Soseki writing haiku in the toilet, or Tanizaki. But what I mean is really the writing it physically. For instance, graffiti, or there is a manga that talks about that toilet as a place of escape. When the artist kind of overcomes the artist's block, creative block, and also escapes from the society that he doesn't want to be, and starts drawing things on the kind of obscene photos. And so then also they get the raise every time he leaves. So there's another aspect of materiality that I'm interested in kind of putting into a separate category under toilet papers. It speaks to delicacy, it speaks to ephemerality, connections, and not through this conventional toilet paper, but still as a paper that we could see. And then we can connect that obviously to Edo period, for instance, where we can see advertising sheets posted on the toilet walls, which also connects us to a broader kind of cultural community.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. I mean, that one quick thing, and then it looks like we have some questions, so I'll be happy to go through some of those. No, I think that this notion of this really kind of enclosed, presumably often, not always, I guess, depending on the quality of one's toilet, but this space also being the space of kind of writerly freedom is really interesting. I mean, given what you just described. And then also I was thinking about this as a place where presumably surveillance is not as acute as it might be outside of that space, but also, I mean, I want to come back to, maybe as we ask some more questions, this notion of the relationship between that kind of literary consumption or production, but then also consumerism, right? I mean, because I like the idea of thinking about, like, how do we, if we want to recuperate the literary value of these things that in some ways seem to be the kind of pure novelty, but I think with something like the Suzuki Koji text, that might be maybe kind of too hasty an appraisal. So, but yeah, okay. Well, let's go to some of the questions in the chat here. So we have a question here from Ernie King, who says, to what extent do we see political messaging showing up on TP, or toilet paper?
Thank you for the question. So so far, what I have found is only the images of politicians, and they are that has been so it's not really literature. It is a type of what I would consider as a novelty, but it has like a longer history. There were toilet papers with an image of Hitler inviting to draw a brown mustache on his face, and obviously there are various toilet papers with images of politicians that then you can choose whomever you want to use for that purpose. Although I think it's also then interesting to consider, is toilet paper in that case, could it be used only to kind of denigrate the politician whom you don't agree with, you do not want to be elected, because yeah, it could also be an object of decoration in the way that I can argue that it can have also a kind of positive value, even if we wipe our rare hands with the thing. But otherwise, on toilet papers, I haven't really in recent years seen anything. Of course, then we can conceptualize it more broadly, that a paper can be used as a toilet paper, and that could be a propaganda papers, and that has been described in literature too.
Great, thank you for that. We have another question here. This is from Aaron Rourke, who asks, who says, it was really interesting to hear about the toilet paper literature distributed by these companies. Are there instances of smaller scale toilet paper literature, maybe created by independent writers and artists?
I haven't really seen, and the only toilet papers that's kind of use the only companies that use toilet paper or literati, they are a little bit more famous. I think that partly it could speak actually to a purely economic reason, that it is harder to have a smaller scale release. It costs more, so for independent writers and artists, that could be an issue. Hayashi Paper Company takes orders, so anyone can do that, but I think that there is always this economic, of course, disparity that we have to pay attention to. And I have tried to write on toilet paper for some of my my works, and writing is actually very hard because it's not sturdy anymore for that purpose. One of my students wanted to submit their final report written on a toilet paper, and I told them that it is fine, but upon first trial, they realized that it is not really that easy as it seems. So I think that one thing is economic aspect. Another thing is that perhaps there is still this attitude towards toilet paper as something that, if you publish something on it, then it's not considered to be worthy.
Great, thank you for that. It also, thinking about that, is also wondering about, the difference between now, kind of mechanical implements like ballpoint pens and so forth, as opposed to like a brush where you could use a much lighter touch and actually pull it off in a different way, right? So just like the kind of technological limitations of certain implements and what they allow. This is a question from Jeffrey Engels. Hi, Jeffrey Engels, who says, really interesting. This talk got me thinking about the toilet in modern Japanese literature, and there are so many famous instances. Tanizaki Junichiro's praise of the shadowy world of the toilet, Nejime Shoichi's famous readings during the 1960s and 70s when he appeared with a toilet seat around his neck, etc. I also remember Takahashi Mutsuo's detailed evocations in his poetry and fiction of homoerotic activities in toilets. From just these examples alone, it seems the image of the toilet seemed to function as a place where lots of critical concerns converge: creativity, sexuality, privacy, individualism. Ellipsis. Do the kinds of themes that converge around the toilet change historically with the continuing development of the materiality of the toilet, from pre-war dark space to contemporary washlets?
Thank you, Jeffrey, for the question. Also, shout out to you. Thank you for coming last week to my performance class. Students yesterday remembered you very fondly. So hello and thank you. Also, thank you for your question. So, of course, as you point out, that sexuality and especially homoerotic activities, that is a very, very important theme. And one of recent studies is Queering Bathrooms by Kavanagh, who really explores that. And there is, of course, a change that we can see from these dark spaces the study is not about Japan though, but there is a similarity in other cultures too. So the change, of course, happens, and with a color, with the space, things change. However, it's still very much connected to sexual violence and sexual also kind of sexing someone, because the objects, how the mirrors are placed, who can see whom, and all these material aspects really contribute to possible entanglements in these spaces. So it is an important theme, and obviously in some of the texts that I want to examine in this particular work on toilet papers, that also comes up. Sexuality is in this manga that I mentioned earlier. That really kind of, it is not homoerotic sexuality, but it is a space where this sexual kind of carnal desire that is oppressed comes out, and that is a good question, I think, how and why these spaces are used for these expressions. So it is a very good question. I still have to think a lot about it, and I also think that when it comes to paper, I just remembered one of, and again, I'm sorry, I am a comparativist. It is not Japan, but Miguel Pinero, New Rican author, he has this very famous play, Paper Toilet, and that is actually the play is around these very violent encounters with among two queer individuals, and a person who is in the toilet stall asking for paper, which would be a newspaper, and police in New York. So it is a very kind of interesting convergence of sexuality, social injustice, violence, and also creativity, and even economics, as the person wants to buy the paper. So yeah, so definitely there is a lot of things that one can do.
Great. Thank you for that really rich answer, and for the really rich question too, Jeffrey. And you needn't apologize for being a comparatist at all. That's part of why you're here, right? So there's another question here from Aaron Brightwell, who says, "Thanks for this talk. I'm still processing, but here goes: Your analysis of how the medium of toilet paper destabilizes the supposed dichotomy of public and private space reminds me a bit of J.J. Abrams' novel S, which also includes material objects, including a napkin, but no toilet paper, I just checked, that could be said to dismantle those boundaries. Do you think there is something particular to toilet paper as a medium? I think what I'm asking is whether there is something particular to the intersections of toilet paper literature and literature, or is this something potentially shared more broadly by texts that destabilize the notion of text?"
Thank you, Erin. It's a very good question. I think very often, even if in the parts of my work that do not focus on toilet paper, but previously, I very often get asked the question, what is particular about fecal matter? So then in those cases, it would be, so what are the differences when it comes to food? What are any other types of things that might be related to disgust? But I do believe that toilet paper is different from other materials, and it cannot be. It can be compared in a sense to look for some similarities, but I don't think that it can be considered as the same thing. And thank you for the work. I'll definitely check it out. And I think the paper materiality, that definitely is a point where we could draw comparisons, but the space of this private space that toilet is in contemporary world, and also the disgust that very often bodily functions and bodily material produces, that is certainly very different from any other material that either is used or that is produced. So I would say that there is something about materiality that allows us to do the comparison, but the difference is too big to put them together. I guess I would have to, work a little bit more and think what exactly would be the points, kind of how I would have to get out that difference or similarity.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the question, Aaron, and thank you for that answer, Linda. So I think maybe along those lines, I mean, lots of questions now come to mind for me. I mean, one is about I think partially thinking about Jeffrey's question about Tanizaki, and just thinking a little bit more partially in relation to the Nuyorican playwright that you mentioned. In the Tanizaki case, if I'm remembering correctly, in Neirai-san, part of the discussion is very much about basically the kind of the purity of this kind of porcelain. I mean, what it means to prefer the quality of light as it hits this porcelain object, as opposed to the deep recesses and the shadows, and that's partially racialized, right? That's partially about the nature of this kind of like really bright antiseptic whiteness on the one hand, versus something that is more Japanese, more traditional, but then I think also by association also kind of less modern, less harsh. And so I'm kind of wondering a little bit about, because you mentioned this notion of violence, but then also say kind of social, kind of economic, let's say gendered, and then also let's presume ethnic or racial differences, kind of how that plays out. And if either in some of the literature that you're reading, I mean, I know that you've talked a lot about, and write really eloquently, I think, about kind of the gender distinctions that are happening, in Japan between, say, Japanese men and women's kind of experiences with these different objects and texts. But could you say a little bit more about let's say, these other kind of markers of social difference, whether that's in terms of class or race, ethnicity, and so forth, as you see them playing out?
Thank you so much for your question. So even before you started taking questions, I wrote down the word surveillance on my paper. And I think that is a very important word when we think about toilet paper as a space in relation to race. That's one of the things, right? And actually, Pinero's play talks about that because, police comes in because it's a seedy. It's considered to be seedy place, and obviously whoever is there, they also are then become suspects. And I would say that there is a possibility to really zoom in on that. I haven't really thought about that in Japanese contexts. Except for obviously these texts, as Tanizaki, who also mentions paper, of course, that are a little bit older, more ancient, and perhaps I would still argue very relevant, but perhaps it would be useful to look a little bit into what's more current. And one of the another aspect that I had been thinking, and I didn't mention it in the talk, but it was related to the communities that I kind of emphasize. But of course, not everyone uses toilet paper. Not everyone has an access to this commodity, something that many of us take for granted. So that's another aspect where these disparities come out. I would say that obviously that the bigger one is economic disparity that it reveals, but then we can also see other, I think, aspects through that. And lastly, the conversation about the color of toilet paper is still ongoing, and that is that if we draw parallels with Tanizaki's text, there's something that is to be said, but especially recently with this emphasis on recycled toilet paper from bamboo, and also it's happening also in Japan, of course, in addition to special toilet papers that, for instance, they started producing for these washlets that are more durable. They also, of course, have a huge production of sustainable materials. But then the question is that very often consumers do not want to buy them if they are not bleached, because there is this association of hygiene, whiteness, which of course has been problematized in scholarship very extensively. When it comes to literary toilet papers, I haven't really encountered anything more recently that I could analyze in detail, and it is more that I'm, my comparativist work than is on radar.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really rich response. I mean, I think to kind of there's so much, and you're already doing so much, but I do wonder. I mean, partially because of given your skills as a comparativist, like kind of how to think about those dynamics as they shift, in terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of class and national identity, around certain types of. I mean, and I don't know. I mean, I learned some things about various kind of anal cleansing tech, kind of strategies around the world, but potential like pride around certain types of practices as being more or less kind of associated with a certain national identity, or more masculine or less masculine, certainly. For instance, depending. Yeah.
There are, of course, currently I would say that there is probably less variety of these materials. Still, I think we do tend to think about toilet paper central world, which is problematic in itself, of course, but also we have to focus on something, especially for the talk. But nevertheless, like if we look at these, especially in previous various texts across the regions, there is constantly this denigration of others' toiletry habitus, which includes this post excretion cleansing. Obviously, cultures that you do not use paper. China, for instance, has criticized Europe for using used rags early on. Then we also, of course, can see very strong kind of split between washers and wipers. And their hygiene, of course, medical gaze comes in, also religion comes in very strongly. Islam Hadith has very strong restrictions how things have to be done, and then we can see how then the othering happens in every culture depending on that. I myself, I grew up in Soviet Union. For me, in Latvia, we would call Russian toilets those that are squat toilets. So you can see that, from childhood, I've been exposed to kind of that's kind of awareness when it comes to othering.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I think part of what you're getting at is the different types of cultural nationalism that, the ways in which this kind of toilet habitus, as you call it, can spur this kind of cultural nationalism around, not just kind of hierarchies like racial or kind of national hierarchies, but also around, and I hadn't thought about this, but if there are kind of aspirations that are tied to a certain kind of toilet habitus as well, right? What it means to move from, a kind of squat situation to a wiping situation, and kind of how these kinds of class, aspirations, for instance, might be somehow narrated in terms of those kinds of things. In some ways, because there are other types of, let's say, kind of outer trappings of civilization or something that are easier, like not anybody, but right, it might be easier to buy a suit or a brand name something or other, but like what it means to actually at the infrastructural level, in that way that the toilets can be attached, right, to this larger network that's not just about the external, but about these much more kind of thoroughgoing changes. That seems like it might be relevant. Cool.
Yeah, there is a large body of work, and English, of course, talks about toiletry habitus, and then he introduces it through the 18th century bourgeois toiletry habitus development in Europe. And then also Warwick Anderson, of course, talks about that. So I think that what interests me is that perhaps this literature and these studies, how I can kind of bring them together and not read literature just as a reflection of these disparities, but also pay attention to what it does as a what kind of effect it has and what kind of materiality it has. So there is this tendency to be very aware of the issues, but then also read literature as a reflection of it, which is not how literature works. And so that is the thing that when I say that materiality and literary analysis is a little bit wanting, I would say.
Well, can we pivot maybe from that idea to think a little bit more? I mean, we have about, I think, 10 minutes, and unless if there are other questions, feel free. If there are other questions that come in, then I'm happy to bring those into the discussion. Otherwise, I have my notes and my own hobby horses, and I'm happy to to learn from Linda by peppering you with more questions. But on that point about kind of how literature kind of works or doesn't, and that reminds me of some of the things you were talking about in terms of the nature of consumerism, and I was just wondering if you could maybe talk more, maybe historicize this move. I'm thinking kind of a post-bubble relationship to the kind of possibilities, the literary possibilities of toilet paper that might not have been there before. I mean, or maybe they were there before, but maybe not as amplified. I mean, so I think that when you showed some of those great slides of different characters on toilet paper and so forth, but really thinking about what the nature of literature is, I think it goes maybe back to something that both Jeffrey's question and Aaron's question raised about how much of this is about the object of toilet paper itself, and how much of this is about things that destabilize boundaries or kind of definitions of the literary, or like what a text is, and how does that change over time. And I'm just wondering if, thinking about the Suzuki Koji thing especially, but also of the Terada that you started with, like in his case, it seems like it's much more about let's say a kind of phenomenological or kind of systems-based. I mean, as a physicist, I'm assuming this is part of that, right? His kind of attentiveness or attunement to the materiality is it seems, I don't want to say call it purer, but it doesn't seem it's not a commercial interest, right? It's much more, it seems like, about this kind of individual engagement, and trying to think about how toilet paper is mediating a relationship with other people. But in the more recent versions, I wonder, like, what does this say, first of all, about the commercial or viability of literature, or lack thereof, right? I think about things like the death of the humanities, but also in terms of a publishing industry that, maybe feels embattled, and so therefore is trying out these other things. I mean, the fact that you can only buy certain things in bulk was interesting to me. Like, there is something about like the kind of calculating the profit margin that one might be able to extract, right, around these kinds of things. But could you just kind of, it's a bit of a jumble, but if you could you talk a little bit more about what this medium does to the relationship between, say, kind of literary value and commercialism or consumerism?
It's a very, very good and broad question, and I really am not sure that I can give you a satisfactory answer. Obviously, I'll just start with your last comment on profit. And I have to say that this is the most expensive toilet I've ever bought. It was shipped from the UK. I think that there is definitely, my immediate kind of thought is related to the fact that even though we think that it's kind of, not important or like flimsy way, like medium to publish something, in fact it is more profitable than other forms of media, and then that made me think a little bit of this development, how perhaps if the washlets take over, that can be compared to the electronic kind of self-publishing and self-sustained way of engaging with literature. There are already various changes on the toilet paper holder place for mobile phones, etc. So there is definitely that change. Another change that we can notice is the reading habits too, right? So most, like, unless it's in this form, most people probably currently go in with their phone and do not read a book or newspapers or magazines. That used to be the case, right? So I can see how my mind coming kind of from this kind of material aspect leads me towards a bubble about that you started your question with. And I can see that in some way there is this perhaps ephemerality or discardable nature of literature, fleetingness, and not even wanting to get attached to that could be seen coming out of post-bubble time, but I would have to think about it more, because there is like this, there are a couple of tensions. I think it's a commercial, then it's a literary, but then it's also not only commercial when it comes to toilet paper and publishing but also the economy, economic situation of Japan that also changed the toiletry habits. So there are so many kind of aspects. Pure commercial interests, clearly that is a huge factor, but I think that some of these are kind of things are very obvious, and I want to kind of dig then. So what about the worst then? Like, is it unworthy? And I argue that no, it has some literary value. So I think your question might bring me better to a conclusion why this form that kind of destabilizes these dichotomies, why then I still kind of hold on to this, not ephemeral but long-lasting in some ways kind of sentiment. So thank you for your question. I really have to think about it more, but I really appreciate it, especially because that is the connections with literature that often studies in waste on waste disregard, and I appreciate that you asked something related to that will give me kind of inspiration to work with this, materiality and literature.
Yeah, sure. No, thank you. No, thank you. I mean, it's a credit to. I mean, my head is buzzing with all these kinds of ideas, and I really appreciate your presenting things as clearly, and it's really rich material. And I feel the fact that I feel weird saying that, I think, is kind of points to some of the potential for what you're doing. I think someone just put in something into this is Georgelina or Jorgelina Corbada says, from a traditional psychoanalytic Freudian approach, this could easily be connected to the anal stage and then homoeroticism, also children's pride showing off their feces as a gift to their mothers in connection to creativity. Yeah, indeed. Yeah. Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you for the comment. There's
and you write about this a little bit in your psychoanalytic criticism and non-objection.
There is definitely that. So I think that kind of gives another additional aspect where I can explore this private and public, right? Because, well, how it kind of develops into this, which we don't show it, but the showing is on the material object that is used in the toilet space.
Yeah. No, it's super fascinating stuff, Linda, and I look forward to hearing more about how you theorize. I mean, this way that this particular medium, really does change the affect. I mean, you mentioned objection, but like what it means then to change what I think of as this pretty like primal kind of sense about aversion to feces or like waste products or whatever, waste matter, or in terms of for women, like what that means in terms of menstrual blood and so forth. But the fact that these kinds of literary, and this medium in particular seems like it's able to change our kind of relationship to questions of value and you know, kind of these affective experiences to a different degree than just like different font or, you know, different kind of materiality. So thank you so much for getting us to
Thank you. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that, you know, I did use it, and throwing into a toilet, it's kind of very weird like image because it's blue. And someone in my class argued that perhaps it would have been more kind of horror-like if it was red. And then another aspect was like, but no, women are used to red papers in the toilet, so that is even that is gendered. So yeah, so thank you so much. There's so much still to do, but I really appreciate everyone's questions and feedback too.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, and that's partially based on Aaron's question about the notion of napkin. If we're thinking about napkin as, you know, sanitary napkin, say, or so. Well, great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Galvan, aka Linda, for this super stimulating talk about your research. I appreciate that you're also kind of working to make it accessible for folks who might not be specialists in Japanese literature or Japanese culture as well, so that we can kind of get a sense of the broader cultural kind of dimensions of what you're talking about, but then also attention to some of the actual kind of primary texts as well. I appreciate that synthesis. So it seems like we're out of questions and we're also out of time. So I just want to thank everybody this afternoon for making it out to our virtual and final CGS noon lecture. I want to thank also, again, all of the CGS staff members who have worked so hard over the course of the year to make these possible. Without whom this would have been, none of this would have been possible. So thank you again. Join me in thanking Dr. Linda Galvan for her presentation.
And thank you for having me. It was really a great pleasure to share with my work.
No, our pleasure for sure. All right, everybody take care.